Welcome to the debate. It is a chilly Friday here in February 2026. Looking out the window, the world feels a bit frozen in place. Winter has certainly settled in. But inside the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, well, the dust has barely settled. We are roughly 4 months into the administration of President Dallin H. Oaks, following the passing of President Russell M. Nelson last September. And, if anyone thought that rush of revelation, that trademark velocity we saw for nearly a decade would slow down, the last few weeks have proven otherwise.
Oh, it certainly has been active. I think a lot of people expected a pause, a moment to just breathe. Instead, we have the lowering of the female missionary age to 18, bringing them in line with the young men, a massive announcement of 55 new missions, and a very dense, philosophically heavy update to the General Handbook about artificial intelligence.
Exactly. And that, I think, brings us to the central question we're wrestling with today. Does the concept of ongoing restoration, this idea that the church constantly adapts its policies through divine revelation, does it successfully bridge the gap between eternal truth and modern reality? Or is this theological agility merely a mechanism for institutional control? Are we seeing a divine responsiveness, or is leadership just reframing course corrections as revelation while, skirting deeper accountability?
That's the faithful reading versus the critical reading in a nutshell, isn't it?
Right. And I'm of the mind that the transition to President Oaks really demonstrates the vitality of the living prophet model. I think these changes are evidence of a church that is divinely agile, prioritizing current revelation over past tradition to meet its global needs.
And I come at it from a different way. I see the ongoing restoration framework as a kind of semantic tool, one that's often used to dodge accountability for past errors. I would argue that the shift to the Oaks administration represents a retrenchment into legalism, and that the church's demand for obedience, even when it's disguised as moral agency, undermines the individual, especially when we refuse to look at the historical wounds, around authority and polygamy that are still festering underneath all these handbook updates.
I see why you'd frame it that way, but let's look at the foundational principle here. We have to go back to Joseph F. Smith, the 6th president of the church. He taught that the church is like a ship. Without the principle of continuous revelation, he said it would be adrift, severed from its head, like a ship at sea without captain, compass, or rudder. The vitality of the faith depends on the fact that it is not static.
It's a powerful metaphor, I'll grant you that.
It is, because it explains the necessity of movement. The ship that doesn't turn sinks. Look at the succession we just witnessed in October 2025. President Oaks took the helm and almost immediately implemented this pro-family policy by equalizing the missionary ages, allowing young women to serve at 18 just like the young men. That isn't legalism. It is a response to the spiritual capacity of the youth. It's proof the captain is at the wheel and adjusting the rigging for the current weather.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the ship metaphor excuses the erratic nature of the navigation. The argument often relies on this distinction between doctrine and policy, implying that policy can change on a dime while doctrine remains eternal. But that distinction feels like an escape hatch. If a past prophet taught something as essential, like the priesthood ban or the necessity of plural marriage, and it is later just discarded as policy, the claim to divine authority is, it's weakened.
But surely you see the difference between a core truth and an administrative application?
I see a difference in retrospect, yes, but only after the change is made. With President Oaks, we are seeing what the Perpetual Covenant analysis calls a move toward juridical rigidity. He selected counselors with legal backgrounds. This isn't just a ship correcting its course. It's a corporation tightening its bylaws. The shift feels less like spiritual agility and, frankly, more like risk management.
I think you're conflating administrative structure with spiritual stagnation. The Noah's Ark metaphor is key here. As President Nelson often taught, and as the Perpetual Covenant source highlights, Noah's specific instructions, build an ark of gopher wood, they don't apply to us today. We need today's instructions. If the church was stuck in the 19th century, it would have died. But look at the recent handbook updates regarding artificial intelligence. That demonstrates a proactive moral framework. Section 38.8.47 was introduced to ensure technology supports rather than supplant spiritual connection. That is wise stewardship, not corporate tightening.
But is it wise stewardship or the fear of losing the narrative? You mentioned the AI guidelines, but let's look at the context. We have Elder Bednar's Things as They Really Are 2.0 address from, late 2024? He warns that AI can suffocate moral agency. But how does the leadership define agency? It seems to be defined strictly as the freedom to choose God and act in righteousness, which, essentially means agency equals compliance.
I think that's a very reductive view of Bednar's theology.
Is it? When you look at the Wackadoodle Timelines blog post or the Reddit essay Mormonism's Pedophilia Problem, there is a deep sense that while the church is tweaking handbook policies about AI or mission ages, it's refusing to address the, what some call the satanic or occult roots of its authority, specifically the legacy of polygamy and sex magic that still haunts the theology of eternal families. You can change the handbook, sure, but you haven't exorcised the ghost.
That is a heavy charge, and we will get to the theology of the family in a moment. But I want to stick to this idea of authority and course correction first. The restoration is a process, not a single event. The Perpetual Covenant source makes this very clear. Just as the priesthood was restored in stages, it wasn't all done in the chamber of Father Whitmer at once. Administrative structures evolve. Under President Nelson, we saw the merging of high priests and elders. That was a strategic move for manpower. Now, under President Oaks, we see a shift in temple announcements. He has moved away from the Nelson-era global announcement model to announcing temples within their specific districts, like the recent one in Portland, Maine.
Right, the shift away from the big reveal at General Conference.
Precisely. This localizes the connection. It shows that the church isn't a monolith. It adapts its administration to better serve the members where they are. It's less about the spectacle of numbers and more about the specific needs of the saints in Maine or Benin or, wherever.
But that shift in temple announcements actually reveals the very inconsistency I'm talking about. When President Oaks suggests the best place to announce a temple is in that temple district, it signals a kind of critique of the previous administration. It wasn't that long ago we were told the global announcements were a sign of the work hastening. Now the method changes and we are told this is the inspired way. It feels less like a unified divine stream and more like boardroom politics where the new CEO pivots the strategy.
Or it's simply a different season, requiring a different approach.
Perhaps. But regarding the process narrative, look at the Reddit analysis of the priesthood ban. The faithful argument is that God works through imperfect men. Fine. But the delay in correcting the ban suggests leaders were hindered by their own biases, not waiting on God. When you label the 2015 LGBT exclusion policy a mistake or policy after the fact, that agility causes real human harm. Real people are ground up in the gears of this process. The oops, we got it wrong defense is it's just hard to swallow when you claim the initial policy was the mind and will of the Lord.
I don't deny that there have been painful moments in our history. The intersection of divine will and human imperfection is messy. But let's pivot to the AI discussion, because I think it highlights the protective nature of this authority. In Elder Bednar's address, he warned that AI could turn people into objects to be acted upon rather than agents who act. The church's response, explicitly in the December 2025 handbook update, is to establish a boundary. It says AI cannot replace the Holy Ghost or human effort in talks and lessons. This isn't about controlling information, it's about preserving the human soul.
That sounds noble, but I see a different anxiety at play. The Reddit discussion on personal revelation points out a glaring double standard. When members receive personal revelation that differs from leadership, say regarding vaccines or a specific policy, they are told they are deceived. They are told to check their revelation against the handbook. So if AI is a tool, the church fears it because AI democratizes information.
How does it democratize it? It just scrapes it.
It exposes the mess of technological pottage, to use Bednar's phrase, but that pottage often contains the historical data the church tries to curate. If an AI can write a better talk than the bishop or answer a doctrinal question more accurately than the stake president by referencing journals the church hasn't highlighted, it threatens the hierarchy. The moral agency Bednar speaks of is really about maintaining the chain of command.
I disagree that it's about chain of command for its own sake. It's about the source of truth. If we outsource our spiritual intellect to an algorithm,
we lose the capacity for revelation. The church is trying to protect the abundant life mentioned in John 10:10. You cannot have an abundant spiritual life if your engagement with truth is mediated by a predictive text model.
But isn't it also mediated by a correlation committee?
A committee of living souls seeking the Spirit is different than a server farm in Virginia. But let's tackle the issue you raised earlier, the elephant in the room. You brought up the Reddit essay by user iJohnTitchy1 regarding the theology of the body and the sex cult characterization.
Yes, it's unavoidable. The essay frames early Mormonism as based on sex magic and the continuation of seeds. Despite the modern family values branding we see with the new 18-year-old mission age for women, the core doctrine of exaltation, becoming gods, is rooted in Joseph Smith's polygamous theology found in DNC 132. It treats women as vessels for male glory.
That is a cynical, modern reading of sacred ordinances.
Is it? We can't ignore President Oaks's unscripted admission in Belgium just last year regarding Heavenly Mother or mothers. That wasn't a slip of the tongue. It felt like a Freudian slip that reveals the polygamous architecture is still completely intact. The theology hasn't changed, only the public relations around it.
I have to push back strongly on the sex cult characterization. That phrasing is designed to shock, not to understand. We have to look at the corporeal man thesis from BYU. The Latter-day Saint view of the body, that God has a body and we are created in his image, is the ultimate elevation of humanity. It's not about objectification, it's about deification.
But deification for whom?
For everyone. Joseph F. Smith spoke about the principle of revelation uniting the family. While polygamy was a difficult historical principle, the modern emphasis is on the eternal family unit, not the number of wives. To reduce the theology of eternal increase to sex magic ignores the genuine spiritual sacrifices made by early saints and the profound theology of embodiment that distinguishes our faith from, traditional Christianity. We believe matter is good. We believe the body is essential.
Well, you can't separate the theology of embodiment from the power dynamics of who controls those bodies. The corporeal man thesis argues that the body is central, yes, but whose body and for whose glory? The Reddit essayist points out that in DNC 132, women are given to men. That is the language of property, not partnership.
But we look at the fruits today. The church is empowering women to serve missions earlier, to take on leadership in councils.
But the ceiling remains. And when we look at the violence that occurred on September 28, 2025, described in the Life Outside the Book of Mormon Belt blog, we see the real-world consequences of this high-pressure theology. A man attacked a stake center, believing members were antichrists.
That was a tragedy. A terrible tragedy.
It was horrific. But why did it happen? Because the church's own us versus them rhetoric, labeling the world as dangerous and prioritizing strict obedience, feeds into a culture of extremism, even if the violence was directed at the church in this instance. The rigid boundaries, like the garment changes mentioned in the blog, they create these high-pressure environments. When you tell people their underwear defines their covenant path, you create a psychological pressure cooker.
My heart breaks for those involved in that violence. But I would argue that such violence emphasizes the need for the church as a sanctuary of order. The world is chaotic and increasingly violent. The principles for church use of AI and the focus on spiritual connection are attempts to lower the temperature, to focus on Christ, and to create a community of peace.
By building higher walls?
By building stronger foundations. Look at the Humanitarian Agility Report from early 2026. While the world is shouting, the church is quietly providing wheelchairs in Belize and elder care in Uruguay. The church's fruit is distinct from the violence of the world. The middle way, mentioned in the Perpetual Covenant source, balancing assimilation with retrenchment, is how the church survives. It's not about withdrawal. It's about engaging the world from a place of gathered strength.
I appreciate the humanitarian work, truly. Nobody disputes the good done by those donations. But charity doesn't erase systemic issues. The middle way is becoming harder to walk. When the church claims agility to meet global needs, like creating 55 new missions in places like Africa and Oceania, that is impressive logistics. But is it exporting a healing theology, or is it exporting the same crisis of authority?
It is exporting the hope of the restoration.
The Perpetual Covenant source notes that Oakes is focusing on the clear parsing of ideas and the written word of policy. That suggests we are heading into a time where the letter of the law might crush the spirit of the individual. If the middle way is just a kinder, gentler authoritarianism, it's not going to hold the rising generation who have access to all the history the church tries to recontextualize.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently. The transition to the Oakes administration represents a maturing of the faith. We are moving from the disruptive innovation of the Nelson era, where we saw constant change, to a period of stabilization and refinement. By formalizing policies like the 18-year-old mission age for women and creating ethical boundaries for AI, the church is proving its theological agility.
Stabilization for the institution, maybe, is for lack of accountability. As long as the church refuses to reckon with the occult and polygamous roots of its theology, while simultaneously demanding strict obedience from members about underwear and media consumption, it will remain a high-demand institution that serves the hierarchy rather than the individual. The wackadoodle timeline is a symptom of a faith trying to look forward without honestly looking back.
It seems we have arrived at the core tension. I see a need for order and divine direction in a chaotic world, and I see the Oakes administration providing that through inspired structure.
And I see a need for transparency and accountability that institutions rarely grant without pressure.
That tension between the need for order and the need for transparency is perhaps the defining struggle of the modern religious experience. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.